Do you know how to turn a simple sentence like this into a sentence with advanced English grammar like this? It's all to do with adding advanced clauses, and in this video I'm going to show you how to write an advanced English sentence by using all of the main clauses and phrases that we use. Let's start with the basics and then make it harder later. Let's start with the simplest sentence. She won. This has a subject and a verb. Some verbs don't have anything after them, and this is all we have, subject and verb. But most verbs require something to follow them. For example, she won a medal, subject, verb, object. Here, the subject does an activity. The activity is won, and then the activity affects the object. What did she win? She won a medal. We can also have subject, verb and adverbial. Here the adverbial gives extra information either about the verb or the whole sentence before. So she won. How did she win? Well, she won in a record time. So in a record time describes the whole of the rest of the sentence. Or we can have subject, verb, complement. She is the champion. Here, the champion describes the subject. So she is the champion, the subject, verb, complement. The complement tells us more about the subject. Let's make our sentence longer though. So our original sentence was, she won a medal. Now let's turn it into a compound sentence. In a compound sentence, we have two parts, two different clauses. She won a medal and her partner won a trophy. So we have the clause, she won a medal. Now a clause is any combination that has a subject and a verb with tense in it. So she won a medal is a clause. Her partner won a trophy is a clause, and we join them together with and. We can make these types of sentences with two clauses or more, which are called compound sentences, using some of the words below, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. But we can also make what's called a complex sentence. In a complex sentence, things are slightly different. This is the sentence we had before where we have two clauses, but we could call these both independent clauses. They could be sentences on their own. They don't have to be connected to each other. However, in a complex sentence, we have one clause which could be on its own, but another clause that doesn't make any sense unless it's attached to the independent clause. She won a medal, although there were many opponents. If we write although there were many opponents on its own, this doesn't make any sense. It depends on the independent clause to make sense. So we call it a dependent clause. So two types of sentences, compound and complex. Let's add even more to our sentence now. She won a medal, although there were many opponents, but we could also say more in this way. She won a medal, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. Notice we've added information after the opponents here, and this is called a relative clause. Let's explain more about how relative clauses make our sentences more complex. So we have two types of relative clause. We have what's called a restrictive clause. Look at the example, there were many opponents who nearly beat her. Which opponents do we mean? Not all of them. Only those who nearly beat her. So in this case, we are not talking about all opponents. We're talking about some of the opponents. And we need the extra information, who nearly beat her, to understand what we mean by opponents. There were many opponents. Some of them nearly beat her and some of them didn't. In this sentence, we're only focused on the ones who nearly beat her. So this is restrictive. It restricts the meaning of opponents to only a smaller number of the total opponents. Compare this with a non-restrictive clause. There were many opponents who all congratulated her. Who congratulated her? All of them. So here we're not restricting the amount of opponents. Here opponents does mean all of them. We're simply giving extra information about all of these opponents. How do we tell them apart when we're reading? Well, a non-restrictive clause will have a comma before the start of the relative clause and also at the end if it's not the end of the sentence. Also, we do not use that with non-restrictive relative clauses. Relative clauses can use relative pronouns to introduce them. Who, what, which, where, when. That could replace who or which in a restrictive clause. So I could have said there were many opponents that nearly beat her. But it cannot replace the relative pronoun in the non-restrictive clause. I could not say there were many opponents that all congratulated her. That would be a mistake. And by the way, if you're wondering whether this is an adjective clause or not, some people teach relative clauses as an adjective clause. They are two names for the same thing. There's no difference between a relative clause and an adjective clause. One thing you can do with relative clauses is you can sometimes leave the relative pronoun out, and there are some specific rules on how to do this. Here are a list of some instances where you can leave the relative clause out. When you have the object, then the subject, and then the verb. What do I mean by this? Well, here the relative pronoun is the object, who. Then we have a new subject for the relative clause, she, and then the verb managed. What does who mean here? Who really means the opponents. It's the object of the main clause before. In this case, we can leave who out. We could say there were many opponents who she managed to beat, but we could also say there were many opponents she managed to beat without who. In the next example, we could also leave out some of the words. When we have the verb to be in the relative clause with a prepositional phrase. Look at the example. There were many opponents who were running behind her. Now, behind is a preposition introducing her, a prepositional phrase. We have the verb to be after the relative pronoun. Who were. Were is the past of to be. In this instance, we can leave who were out. We could say there were many opponents who were running behind her, or we could also say there were many opponents running behind her without who were. One more type of clause where we can do that is when you have the subject followed by a passive form. In the example at the bottom of the page here, we have a passive in the relative clause. There were many opponents who were beaten by me. So here, who is the subject of the relative clause because it comes immediately before the verb phrase, so it must be grammatically the subject. Were beaten is a passive form. We have the verb to be followed by the past participle. Here we could use the full form. There were many opponents who were beaten by me, but we could also leave out who were and simply say there were many opponents beaten by me. Now there are some instances where you cannot leave out the relative pronoun. If you have the relative pronoun as the subject followed by to be followed by an adjective, you have to say everything. There were many opponents who were tired. We can't say there were many opponents tired. Also, if it's the subject and the verb, there were many opponents who sprinted to the line. So here, who is the subject, sprinted is the verb. It's not to be, we have to say them all. We cannot leave it out. With non-restrictive clauses, we normally cannot shorten these. We normally have to say them in full. For example, there were many opponents who all congratulated her. We cannot leave out the word who here. But there is one case where you can leave out words with a non-restrictive clause. And again, that's when you use the passive. There were many opponents who were all beaten by her. Were and beaten is our passive phrase. We put all in the middle to add extra meaning to beaten, but it's still a passive because we have to be followed by the past participle. Here we can leave out who were, and we could say there were many opponents, all beaten by her. Now we're going to add another clause. Let's leave behind relative clauses. We're going to keep the relative clause in this sentence and we're going to build it a little bit more. This time we're going to add an adverb clause. Look at the beginning of the sentence. Because she ran so fast, she won a medal, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. Look at how long our sentence is getting already, but we've got a long way to go yet. So the adverb clause here is because she ran so fast. Adverb clauses tell us how, why, where, when, to what degree, or under which conditions, about the rest of the sentence or the main verb. They can go before or after a clause. In our first example, because she ran so fast comes before the main clause, she won a medal. And don't forget, she won a medal is still our main clause. Everything else has just been added on. However, it could also go after a clause. In the example below, we have an adverb clause which tells us where. She won a medal where the track ended. This is an adverb clause because it describes the whole sentence. It doesn't just describe a medal here. It doesn't tell us more about the medal, so it's not a relative clause. It's telling us about the whole activity of the sentence, and it comes after the main clause here. She won a medal. Where did it happen? Where the track ended. Our sentence can get longer, still get longer. Here's another extension. Here's the sentence so far. We're using because as our adverb clause, and here's another addition, a reporting clause. Because she ran so fast, she won a medal, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her, the newspapers wrote. What's happened here? Well, we have added a clause which reports information, or it's taking a step back and saying how someone else reports it. This is a clause that has full tense in it. The verb wrote is a past simple verb. If it was happening now, we would say the newspapers are writing. So it does take tense and therefore it is a clause. Again, it could go at the end or the start of the sentence. If we put it at the start, we could say this. The newspapers wrote that because she ran so fast, she won a medal, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. Here we use that to join the reporting clause to the rest of the sentence we've developed, and we'll come back to that clauses at the end of the video, so wait for that. Now we're going to add a phrase. What's the difference between a phrase and a clause? We'll come to that in a moment. So far our sentence looks like this. Let's add another combination of words to it. This time it's a phrase, a participle phrase at the beginning of the sentence. Impressed by her performance, the newspapers wrote that because she ran so fast, she won a medal, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. Impressed by her performance is a participle phrase. It's a phrase and not a clause because the verb does not take tense. Here, impressed is always impressed. It doesn't matter if it's past, present or future, perfect or simple or continuous. It's a participle form. There are two choices for the participle, either the past participle impressed, or you could in some circumstances use the present participle, which is the ing form, but it doesn't work here for reasons I'll explain now. So what does a past participle phrase do? It can be an adverbial for the whole sentence. It can be a reduced passive. And that's what we have here. Impressed by her performance really means they were impressed by her performance. It could be a shortened if condition, and it could be something that happened before the main clause. But in all of these cases, the past participle phrase introduces something that affects what comes afterwards. So they were impressed by her performance. So what did they do as a result? The newspapers wrote about it. So who do we mean? Who was impressed by her performance? Well, it's referring to the subject of the next clause, the newspapers. So literally what we mean is the newspapers were impressed. Therefore, the newspapers wrote about it. But we can reduce the passive here to make it a participle phrase. We can also have present participle phrases. Again, these are adverbial in nature because they say something about the rest of the sentence, or they have a special relationship with the rest of the sentence. The different possibilities are here. It could be that we're introducing the result of an action or the reasons for an action. And here, this is in our example here, we are introducing the reasons for an action. Knowing it was an interesting story, that gives the reason why they wrote about the story. It can also describe an activity at the same time as the main clause or give more information on the subject of the main clause. By the way, I should point out here that the newspapers refers to the people who write the newspapers. We're not talking about a piece of paper writing something. The newspapers is the company of people who write newspapers. Sometimes we talk about them like that. Sometimes we also say journalists. But another way of saying journalist is to call them just simply the newspapers, as if that's their job. There are also other participle phrases, for example, having followed by a past participle. And these introduce a clause with a past or perfect effect. So look at the example here. Having discovered the story, the newspapers wrote about it. So the newspapers wrote about it. This was caused by having discovered the story. Having discovered the story came first, and that led to an effect. And the effect here was the newspapers wrote about it. Normally, the subject in a participle phrase is the same as the main clause, but it can have its own subject in certain conditions, such as with sense verbs. For example, she saw her opponents running behind her. Here, running is a present participle, and it has its own subject, her opponents. So it can be a bit confusing here. You would expect after a noun, if you have a verb, that verb would take tense. But here it doesn't. It's a present participle. How do we know? Because she saw. Saw is a sense verb, and afterwards we can have a phrase that has its own subject followed by the participle. We can add defining information too. Here is our sentence so far. Now let's add some extra definitions to some of the words. Here we're going to add some words in the middle. So, impressed by her performance, the newspapers wrote that because she ran so fast, she won a medal, the prize for victory, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. The prize for victory. This describes what? It describes the word medal. This is called an appositive phrase. This is where you have a noun phrase that gives extra information about the noun before it. It's a little bit like a non-restrictive clause, but it's just a noun phrase. She won a medal, the prize for victory. When do we use this appositive phrase? We normally use it when the word we use perhaps isn't obvious to the reader or listener. In this case, we probably didn't need it because most people know what a medal is. But I'm giving you an example of what it would look like. If you were not sure, if the reader or listener understood the medal, or if you wanted to emphasize a feature of the medal that you think is important, then you can add this appositive phrase, a little noun phrase separated from the rest of the sentence by commas coming immediately after the noun you want to describe. It is possible to use a present participle in this appositive phrase. For example, the medal now hanging from her neck was golden. It has the same effect. It tells us more about the medal. Here it tells us where it is. Here's another way of adding details to words. Here's our sentence so far. Now we're going to add more information after the words her performance. Impressed by her performance in the Olympics. What's happened here? Well, we're giving more information about the word performance. How do we do this? By adding a noun phrase, or should I say, turning her performance into a longer noun phrase. Noun phrases take a main noun and then add information to them to say more about them. In front of the main noun, you could add an article. Whether you say a performance or the performance makes a big difference to what you mean by the word performance. A determiner or an adjective. All of those things tell us more about the noun, but they come before. But we can also add words after the noun in a noun phrase. We can add a preposition phrase, which is what we have here, in the Olympics. Where was the performance? In the Olympics. So the preposition phrase here tells us more about the noun performance. We can also add a relative clause, which we've seen before, or a to plus infinitive clause. All of these will lead to a longer noun phrase. And we can also combine more than one of these. We can have all of them together in the same noun phrase. And some parts we can even repeat. You can have as many preposition phrases added onto each other as you want, but don't add too many because it will make the sentence confusing. The complexity is going to increase even more. Here's our sentence so far. Let's add something to the end. Impressed by her performance in the Olympics, the newspapers wrote that because she ran so fast, she won a medal, the prize for victory, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. How she runs so fast is a mystery. And the words in red are what we call a noun clause. Look at the extra words in red at the bottom again. How she runs so fast is a mystery. Now, what's the grammatical construction of the sentence? Is the main verb here. A mystery is the object. So what is the subject? Well, here it's actually all of the underlined words. How she runs so fast. It's a noun clause because it has a clause for the purpose of the noun. It has a subject in the form of a clause. So why would we do this? Well, it emphasises the meaning of the question word. How she runs so fast. In what way does she run so fast? We could have simplified this by simply saying her fast running, her speed. But we want to emphasise that there is a mystery involved. The mystery is, well, how? How does she do this? How does she run so fast? How she runs so fast? Well, that is a mystery. So we have a clause here for the subject. We can make noun clauses with any question word. WH words followed by a clause, or how followed by a clause. Look here, we have how, then a clause. She runs so fast. She is the subject of the noun clause and runs is the verb of the noun clause. Put it all together and you have one noun clause acting as a subject for a longer clause. Is a mystery. And the noun clause reflects an emphasis on the meaning of the question word. So if we said when, we'd be focusing on the time. If we said where, we'd be focusing on the place. Let's add one last clause before we finish. Here's our sentence so far. It's one sentence, although it's so long with so many different clauses and phrases. And now let's add a that clause to the end. Impressed by her performance in the Olympics, the newspapers wrote that because she ran so fast, she won a medal, the prize for victory, although there were many opponents who nearly beat her. How she runs so fast is a mystery that I cannot explain. So we have a clause at the end. The clause here describes mystery, beginning with that. And you can see it's a full clause afterwards. I cannot explain, subject verb, a that clause. There are many ways in which we can make a that clause in English. Let's go through the most significant ones now. You can use a that clause as a direct object in a sentence. She knew that I could not explain it. She is the subject, knew is the verb. That I could not explain it is the object. Let's think of some alternatives here. She knew a way. She knew an idea. A way, an idea, take the object. Here we've replaced it with a longer phrase that has the same idea as an object of the sentence. She knew that I could not explain it. We can also have it as a subject complement. The fact is that I could not explain it. So here, that I could not explain it tells me more about the subject, which was the fact. Which fact? Oh, the fact that I could not explain. So here the that clause is a complement for the subject, which is the fact. It can also be an adjective complement. I am pleased that you won. So I is the subject, am is the verb, pleased, that's the adjective that describes I, it's the complement of I, and then that you won tells us more about why you are pleased. So that you won is added onto the adjective. And you can also have a noun complement, which is a relative clause, which we looked at earlier. And that's the example we have here in this long sentence above. A mystery that I cannot explain. So here, that I cannot explain describes the word mystery. And finally, this is not used very often, but you can do this grammatically and still be correct. You can use a that clause as a subject. That I cannot explain is surprising. You won't hear this very often, it's not used much, but if you read a lot of English literature, you will see people use a that clause as the subject of the whole sentence. Basically, it means this topic, this idea, this subject. What's the topic or the subject? Well, it's I cannot explain, and it's surprising.